Welcome to Fontribute, where we talk about fonts and their attributes. Fontribute. So hi everyone, this is Thomas Jockin. Hope you're having all a great week. I wanted to talk about with you today a major concept, or two major concepts in type design that I think is worth having a discussion about. Those are the concepts of skeleton and contrast. And we're going to use these two seemingly very different typefaces to express how these concepts are explored in type design. So let's get started. I have here two examples. One is trim, other is Gandur. So again, as I said in the beginning, these seem very, very different. They look and they feel very different, but there's a certain conceptual approach that I think ties these two together and allow us to have this discussion now about skeleton and contrast. But before I move on with that, I'll just quickly explain what I mean by contrast and skeleton by going to the letter uppercase O to start. Okay, so we have these two letters together. What I mean by skeleton is if you were to reduce these letter forms into just an abstracted concept of how they would exist as a body. Imagine like a human person, right? A human being is made of multiple units put together: skin, muscle, bone. The bone is very different from the muscles, and the muscles are covered with skin. But the skeleton is the base structure that everything's built off on top. Not a doctor, don't quote me on my anatomy knowledge of this, just go with me for the metaphor on this. Contrast would be like the muscles. They're the meat that's attached onto the skeleton that allows that skeleton to move and move across and do its work as a body. So again, focusing on this uppercase O between these two different typefaces, trim and Gandur, let's discuss some things. First, let's look at the left side where we have Gandur. What we see here is, I think, an example where contrast overtook skeleton. Here's what I mean by that. Here, I'm going to draw how you conceptually, if you drew as a calligraphic pen that creates contrast at a steady angle, here's how you would draw it. You would start on the left side, go down on a vertical line, and then this diagonal line you would do, a diagonal downstroke. Then you would bring your pen back up. You would do then a disjointed diagonal stroke down in an angle, and then a vertical downstroke. Notice that the reason why you can see this as an O is as a result of the contrast. It's the play of thicks and thins at the upper left joint and the bottom right joint. There's no connecting strokes that make this create to an O. The only way you're able to do this is because you're doing with your eye, you're abstracting from this contrast to get an implied continuation of the stroke to make it feel like an O. This is what I mean. So the skeleton's actually these two distinct broken strokes that rely on the contrast of this pen, this conceptual pen that made it, to connect the strokes together. And contrast that to the trim O, notice that this is clearly a case of the skeleton dominating, because you can see it's a stroke that goes from the top, you go down, then you go arced on the bottom, then you go from the bottom to the top, and then back over again. So it's and the contrast of the weight being distributed is not defining the letter. It's playing second fiddle to the skeleton form that's being presented to us. And this is how these two tie together, is different approaches of this idea of flat sides, flat curved sides. That's the concept between these two that I brought them together in this conversation with Fontribute. But what I find so really interesting from a type designer's perspective is this different interplay of skeleton and contrast. Which one is more important? What is the priority? Are you relying on contrast to define the letter, or are you relying on a conceptual skeleton to define the letter? Let's move on to the other letters to talk about this more, like the uppercase A. This is another example. So notice with Gandur's A, you have a vertical stroke that goes down, then you have this diagonal stroke that goes down, and then you have the crossbar. Trim, it just looks like the A is the A. It goes diagonal stroke, a little bit of over, then another diagonal stroke, then a crossbar. Again, notice in Gandur that the way your eye is able to combine the strokes together, and actually in that top left corner, the note that this is an A is because of the contrast that exists. I think that's a theme I want to draw in. And also notice again in trim too, the system model is trim the sides to be vertical strokes. The decision was made that this diagonal stroke would have this inclusion as well. Going on to the D, I think the D really drives this point home. Probably to make it so that this D will be legible and understood as not an O, because of the modularness of this whole system going on. Notice in Gandur, there's the vertical stroke, then there's like this slant stroke that's completely disjointed. And again, so that's that point of like oblivion where the strokes come together. It's relying completely on contrast so your eye knows what's what. If you don't have that, you can't define what this letter is. And then again, repeating diagonal stroke over to the right, from the left to the right, and then downstroke. Without this use of contrast and how the skeleton was formed to make this letter, you could not. If you didn't have these, it would be too confusing compared to the O. Meanwhile, a trim doesn't have to worry about too much about that. It just goes through a normal D skeleton, and then it just, as the curve on the right side goes, it stops abruptly, goes flat, and then curves again. That's its modus operandi. So far in the uppercase, you can see some limitations here, but not too bad. The designer has come to some good conclusions of how to approach this, especially for the Gandur contrast-focused style. I think it's in lowercase we start seeing some tensions in this model. So let's move forward to lowercase n. So if I'm using the discussion of how I define the skeleton of Gandur's Ed, there's a vertical stroke, then notice this completely disjointed diagonal stroke on the top, and then a downstroke. Again, your eye is only able to assess that this is a lowercase n by the nature of the contrast between the first stroke and the second stroke, and where they meet. It's the interplay of negative space and positive space, and the contrast that defines this as an N. If this N was to be made too thin, say you made a hairline stroke. With this style of letter, you would not be able to tell this is an N. It'd be very difficult. I think there'd be some ambiguity in legibility and how it'd be approached. Meanwhile, with trim, it follows just the same model. Trim is very straightforward what it tries to do. It's got straight sides, and then it has this arc on the top, and then always this abruptness. There's always this curve on the top, the same kind of radius of the curve usually, and then just rapidly cuts to a corner on the side. So it's following that. But it has a lot more room for potential for weight because of its priority on skeleton first, then contrast. Its contrast is following like a traditional sans serif would. Meanwhile, Gandur is following a calligraphic model where contrast actually took prominence over skeleton in this case. Moving on to the S. The S is a very dynamic letter in Gandur. So we have this, but it's following the same idea of this broken stroke. We'll focus on the spine first. A downstroke, a mini downstroke, a diagonal stroke from the main part of the spine, and another downstroke. And then the top part and bottom part of the terminals are handled as a kind of a two-movement stroke. So you got diagonal over, down, downstroke, diagonal. That'll be the order of ductus of how the strokes should be put together. It's following a very modular system. And again, it's relying on contrast to define the letter. Notice the kind of point to oblivion that happens on the upper left and the bottom right. Notice that. Trim again is following the same idea. It's got arc on the top, straight terminal on the right side. And then I find it interesting the spine. It's a very interesting movement. So it has to have this flatness on the side. Then it goes through a natural curve, like a very traditional curve. And then goes flat again on the right side of the spine. And then it comes over for the terminal into a vertical stroke. Personally, I have a lot of admiration for this because it's very difficult to do this. To have this kind of abruptness and then have this curve and then abruptness again. It's very challenging. I think as a type designer, I have a lot of respect for that. I think it's a very challenging rendering to produce that and not feel too awkward. I think this design does a pretty good job of achieving that. I would say. I would have to sit there for a very long time to get that figured out personally. to make that feel harmonized really well. I think the S is very challenging because again, it goes from that flatness to such a lot of movement. And notice how almost horizontal that spine is. So there's a lot of time for curvature to happen, and then it has to flatten again. My suspicion is the designer probably decided to have this spine be so flat, basically almost not 90 degrees, but like kind of more not as steep of an angle for the spine, probably to buy him more time or her more time to create this curvature and make it feel more natural with the flatness that's going to happen on the upper left and bottom right sections of the spine stroke. But moving on to the lowercase g, same example. Basically, the G in Gandur is a broken stroke. It's basically two separate strokes that rely on its contrast to define the form. Vertical stroke, then diagonal stroke, then back on the top, diagonal stroke, downstroke, and then the descender stroke. If this was made like to a hairline, then it would probably start breaking down in legibility because it's relying on the contrast to define the stroke, to define the whole letter as a form that trim doesn't have to worry about because again, it's following the same model as we discussed before. Lastly, the last letter we'll talk about is the lowercase a. The lowercase a is an interesting idea. It's actually in Gandur. So you have a horizontal stroke, then a separate broken downstroke. That's how we were able to get this angle. Notice this angle that's going on the upper right corner. And then for the bowl section, it's a disjointed three-part stroke. There's a diagonal, a downstroke, and another diagonal to make the form. It's a very complicated composition with a lot going on in there. But again, it's relying on how the contrast is manipulated in the stroke to be legible as a lowercase a. Trim, I think, does an interesting move of in the bowl. Notice it kind of I like to call a potbelly bowl. Basically, notice it kind of comes to like almost way bottom in the stem to arch over at the top of that bowl. Then to get the flat side, of course, as needed in this project, and then curve back up again into itself. Notice that. So notice that difference between, excuse me. Notice that within the project of trim, it's maintaining that flat sides, but it tries to incorporate some softness and roundness in the top and bottom strokes wherever it can. And one of the ways the designer may have chosen to do that with a lowercase a was to create this, what I call the potbelly a bowl. Okay, so with all this, I hope you can take away the main theme or concept in type design of skeletons and contrast. That type designers always negotiate between these two different concepts of which one is more important. What is the priority of thinking as a type designer? Are you thinking about how these letters are made as a skeleton form? This stroke goes this way, then it goes that way, and then it connects this way. Or are you more interested in contrast? How does the distribution of thick thins by a tool instrument of some kind going to define the letter? I think a lot of type designers when they're learning have a lot of time struggling with these two modes of thinking because you usually have to do both at the same time. Sometimes you focus on one, sometimes you focus on the other. It's based on the project and the goals you're trying to go with the project. But I think even within the same concept of flat side curves, you can see very different approaches based on how you decided to focus on contrast or skeleton. The end result is Gandur gives, again, here's what both of them do. It gives a very modular, regimented feel in the composition because of this program and very systematic of the programming of all round strokes have flat sides, basically. But the end result, based on these other decisions made, result in Gandur being kind of way more older. It feels more antiquated, ancient. Certain cultural backgrounds, you say German, old style, like in a very Gothic mode of thinking, because of the association of Blackletra. This gives a feeling. This is certainly like a Blackletra genre, typeface. So you would give those kind of connotations you get with that. Trim goes a whole different direction. It's like startup web, techie industry kind of stuff, because it's focused on a sans serif that's very modular and regimented, but with a certain softness built into it with the way the curves are structured. So this has been Fontribute. This is Thomas Jockin. Hope you've been enjoying this series so far. Please subscribe if you haven't yet, and so you can hear about the next episode I do. I do this every week. And hope you've learned a lot from this. If you could share any comments, feel free to do so. I'll be sure to reply. This is Thomas Jockin. This has been Fontribute, and thank you so much for your time. Take care. Bye.